Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I get an honor of speaking with my buddy Katharine Schellman again about her new book, The Last Drop of Hemlock. Welcome back, Katharine.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's great to be here again. I love our chats.
I do as well. I want to start, I'm going to show the cover of the book again. I'm going to start with the cover. Who designs the covers of these books, this series of books?
The cover gets done through Minotaur, the publisher.
Right.
And I just feel like they knock it out of the park every time. Like they really understand the vibe of the books. And I mean, we always say, like, don't judge a book by its cover. Like that is such a cliche, but we all do. Everyone, you walk into a bookstore and there's so many books there. Everyone is looking at covers to start with. And I feel like I've really lucked out in terms of having just these very evocative, eye-catching images that really give you a sense of what the book is going to feel like when you're reading it. So I feel very fortunate there.
I agree. And I do think we do find things because we're visual people. We see something that appeals to us. But I totally agree with you. I think they certainly get the vibe of the books. This is the second one in this series. And the cover is just perfect. It's perfection.
It's so funny seeing you holding that because I actually haven't seen a physical copy of it yet.
Oh,
it's all like the weird shipping stuff that's still going on. My copies haven't arrived. So I'm looking, I'm like, ooh, I want to touch it.
Right. I'll send it to you. It's worth a read, Katharine. Once again, you bring back some of the same characters we saw in Last Call at the Nightingale. You bring back Vivian and Bee and Vivian's sister Florence. And I feel I know these characters and I enjoy them so much. And you brought us another mystery again. So that's a good thing. How tied to these characters are you?
I have to get so invested in my characters when I'm writing them. That's where I start with every story. Some writers start with, they have a particular scene in mind that sort of leads them into the rest of it, or they have their setting, or I always start with characters. Like for me, I need to know who the people are that I'm dealing with. And then once I know who they are, I get a sense of the world that they're living in, because I think who we are is so dependent on the environment that we are living in. And then once I know who these people are and what environment they're in, I can see sort of the conflicts that creates for them. And then that tends to be what leads into the story and into the mystery and into sort of their personal arcs. But for me, it always starts with the characters and with just these people that I find very interesting and very engaging, but also very deeply flawed. And I think that's always what leads to sort of the most interesting storytelling, where you have these very flawed people living in this very flawed, imperfect world, and just the conflicts that creates either in their broader lives or between them as individuals. And I find that so fun to explore. And I think that's really, for me, that's very easy to connect with, even in a historical setting, because so much of that like interpersonal conflict, or the way we interact with our world and are in conflict with our environment, that's the same no matter what era you're living in. Like people in the 1920s are having the same fights with their sisters that I'm having with my sister now. Like it feels very consistent and very relatable, I think.
I agree with you. And I think that the thing is humanity. And so that's one of the things. And I also, from reading the after notes, I'm sure that has a better title than I just gave it. The acknowledgments, I think it is. So I read some of the things that you put in there, and I realized the amount of history that you've dug through to make sure that it's accurately correct. And then I also look at the 1920s, which we see in television and books. It's a jazz age and it's a lot of fun and it's a lot of decadence. And yet there was so much poverty and so much class distinction and racism and classism and elitism. And then I think, what has changed? It's different now, but it's really rather similar. Do you want to speak on that?
I think I found that a lot of times in my research too, it's really caught me off guard because we think of, here's this era that's 100 years ago. It feels like it should feel so different. But there's still, that really the huge gap of inequality and like the problems of, just these very isolated elite communities that are not, whatever is going on broadly, more culturally, they're not being affected by it in the same way as people who don't have the same resources. You look at something like prohibition, and when that went into effect, one of the really weird rules that came with it was that you could, obviously buying alcohol was illegal. Lots of people did it anyway.
Right.
It's a big part of the book. But it was not illegal to drink any alcohol that was already in your possession. So wealthy people who had lots of money to spare and lots of space in their homes or their second homes or their businesses, they spent, the time before prohibition was passed, but between that and when it went into effect, buying up what was called provisions. they just stocked up on it with like just cases of alcohol. And then that was perfectly legal for them to then consume that as often as they wanted in their private homes. And that's just and it's a glaring example of the way that if you had money and you had resources, you had a perfectly easy way to get around this law that affected everyone else in a completely different way. And I think that's something that in a lot of ways hasn't changed. If you have resources, it's a lot easier to get around laws that are either damaging or inconvenient or actively harmful to someone who doesn't have those resources. I mean, you even think of something like if you see like a parking sign and it's like, park here, it's illegal, you'll be fined. Well, being fined for something legal just basically means it's legal if you have money because you can pay the fine. Whereas if you don't, it's a lot more of a deterrent to you. So I think there's a lot of ways in which that, the interaction between what is actually illegal for people with resources versus people without those resources is very much the same, even across that 100-year gap of time.
I totally agree. We have a former First Lady of California who never, ever parked in a parking space. She just left her car in the middle of the street. But it was never towed. So there is this big thing about resources.
Yeah.
One of your characters, Mrs. Henry, is a collector of people who need help.
Yes.
And that is something that I find so beautiful. I loved Mrs. Henry in the first book, and I love her again now. She takes on the role of the global mother, maybe. Is that what you feel about her?
I think so. I think in a lot of ways, to me, she's a community builder, and she's not limited in who she thinks of as part of her community in a lot of ways. She tends to see we have something in common, whether that's our race or our social status or our lack of money and resources. And she sees like we need each other as a result of those similarities. And so she collects these people who need that kind of help, and she doesn't hesitate to offer it. I can't remember now whether it's in the first book or the second one. I think it's in the first book, but there's this family that's new in New York, and she brings them, it's only one scene, but she brings them into her life and into her home and is like, you need this help, and here I'm offering it to you. And I think there are a lot of people out there like that, especially in, I think, more marginalized communities or more impoverished communities. I think because people have to band together, they have to create community in order to survive. Whereas again, when you have those resources, you're a little more self-sufficient, even if that's not a healthy way to be, because we need that community. We need that sense of depending on each other. I think that makes us all so much more functional and happy, both as individuals and as a society. But I think you see that urge to create community and to reach out and sort of band together. And like you said, collect people into a group that can support each other in people who are living in those more marginalized communities. And I think that's that's something we all could benefit from more, but
Absolutely.
it's something that I think you really see in people who don't have necessarily the social supports or the monetary supports already in place. They have to provide that for each other.
I have found in life that that is something that I see quite often. I see the willingness to help someone else, oftentimes by people who don't have enough for themselves, and they realize that lack in their own life. So to switch the channel just a little bit, you've also brought back some people who are extremely challenging. You bring back Hattie Wilson and Miss Ethel, and I tell you, so just as we talked about in your first book, Nightingale, you write a lot of strong women characters, and that's so fun to read. And these two particular people they're on the topper end of the scales. You know, they are not dependent on the neighbors to take them in, and they cause a lot of mayhem for our main characters, and I love that. Are they fun to write?
Oh, they are. It's fun to write a villain, or if not a villain, then I mean that's a very strong, because people are people and everyone's going to do
Yes.
some bad things and some good things. But to write someone who's such an antagonist, and to write them, you have to, for me at least, I have to get in that mindset a little bit. Like, okay, I don't want to just have them do antagonistic things or have them throw up obstacles for no reason. Like, it has to make sense to them why they
Yes.
are doing those things. Otherwise, it just comes across as this very caricatured, like, aha, you're a bad guy. So it is very fun to write them, but it also, like, it's very cringy. Also, like, I get through writing those things. It's like, oh, I don't like it, but then I hope other people feel that way reading it too.
Well, I did. I mean, because I'd sort of met them in the first book, and they recur in this book. The great thing is we saw who they were in the first book, and we see that they remain the same. And I think that's human nature, because it isn't very often that people really change an awful lot unless something traumatic has happened. Typically, if you're a good person or a bad person, and that's so simplistic, then you remain that type of person. I do want to mention one character that I was so thrilled to see Mr. Sun reappear. That was it's very short, just as it was in the first book, but it was just so loving and heartfelt. Was that fun to write?
It was, because, as you know from reading the books, and anyone who picks them up will do, family and, like, found family, and that
Yes.
idea of who is filling those roles in your life is a very consistent through line. And in a lot of ways, it's sort of background. It underlies a lot of those relationships. And in particular, Vivian and Florence's search for their own family of origin, and sort of how they feel about that search, which is in a lot of ways two very different sets of feelings for them. But it felt very, I felt like writing that book, there's so many hard things that happen, and so many difficult relationships. It was very much a moment for me as the writer to just say, like, okay, sometimes someone new comes into your life, and it might just be for a short amount of time, but it can be a good relationship. It can be a good moment.
Absolutely.
And you sort of get that breath of, like, oh, okay, some of this is okay. Because I think that ends up, no one's life and no one's relationships are consistently one thing or the other. People come in and out, and we have all these different interactions with them, and some of them will be challenging, and some of them will be very nurturing, and everyone experiences both of those. And you hope it'll be more on the second one. But in a book, at least, it's a little more interesting if it's mostly the first one, but you still need those moments of the other one too. Otherwise, it's just,
well, exhausting. I think otherwise it is exhausting. I think that's just the word for it. That's a great thing about your books. We have a cross section of all different kinds of characters, all different kinds of people, especially the found family. It runs throughout it. The Chens show up again. They do some things that are just so heartfelt. But I feel like we got a clear picture of who they were. And that's one of the things that I celebrate about your books, that I think that you do so eloquently is you give us a broad spectrum of people, and we, the readers, get to choose who we like, who we don't like, and to root for them. And you do give us moments where in the darkest hour there's someone to root for, and I think it's something that keeps me wanting to turn the page.
Well, I appreciate knowing that, because I know a lot of the characters in these books are, even the main characters, even the protagonists, are difficult people in a lot of ways. In my other series, the Lily Adler books, I think it's much more, there's a little more of that black and white mystery where there's, even if characters make decisions that you don't necessarily agree with, overall, you're like, oh, I can point to this person and say, you are a good person. You do good things in the world. With the Nightingale books, there's a lot more gray area, I think, not just in the overall story, but even within the individual characters. Like these are people who are making a lot of questionable choices in order to survive in a very difficult world. And I think a lot of times, even writing, Vivian's the main character, but even a lot of times writing her, I'm like, and now she's going to do something stupid. Like, she is not going to make a good choice in this scene. But that's that character that feels like what she would do in that moment, because she is a very flawed, and I think in a lot of ways very hurt person. And she's seeking out a lot, like she's seeking that found family, and she's trying to find a place for herself. But in doing so, she pursues a lot of directions that are not smart and are not healthy.
And she's young.
She is, yeah.
She's young, and I think that's one of the things when I read the first book, that we really see so much more, that they're both young. They were orphaned, and they're trying to find their way in the world. And of course, as I said earlier, as a reader, that's so fun because we too are finding our way through their world.
Yes.
And with Vivian, we still have a bit of will she, won't she, in so many different ways. And I love that. And then I love the fact that this time Florence gets to be a little bit more out of her shell. And that is so sweet. I enjoyed that a lot.
Florence is a very fun character to write. It's interesting because looking back at the first book, the relationship between her and Vivian became so central. And it actually wasn't in the first draft. Florence was very much a periphery character. And I think in a lot of ways, in the first book, the relationship between her and Vivian became very much the emotional heart of the story. And that continues a bit in this book too, in Last Drop of Hemlock. I think that that's something that really grounds Vivian. Florence also makes much better choices, I think, than Vivian does.
Well, and I think here again, I think you've done such a good job with that, because Florence in the first book really stays home, basically. And it is a little easier if you don't have the world's trappings circling around you and tempting you. So Florence does get a chance to sort of stand back and say, well, maybe we should go left or right or whichever direction. That's, of course, the impulsiveness of Vivian is what is delicious. It's, that she's going to run straight ahead, whether she runs into the wall or not, but she's going to run at full force because in her mind, this is the way she has to go. And I love that about her.
She is fun to write because personally, I am more of the play it safe homebody type. I am more the Florence in my life. But it's really fun to get out of that mindset and be like, if you are a person who is just going to be like, who cares? I'm gonna do this. This seems like this is the first thing I thought of, and so I'm gonna do that first thing, and I'm not gonna think it through past that. It's very fun to write that character.
Well, and I think that's why we have such a good time chatting, because I'm on Vivian's team. It's like we'll deal with the carnage later whenever we have to come back to it. So it is important, because we've talked about a lot of broad things. It is important to say that this is a fine mystery. It is wonderful. It's engaging. It's something you want to read. We have a death that starts off the book. So, we're doing all the right mystery things. But I did want to talk to you about sort of the general idea of where this book is set and who these people are. And once again, it is a wonderful read. The cover, again, is, if I ever learn to hold it in the right place, The Last Drop of Hemlock. Katharine, do you have social media or a website you'd like to share?
Absolutely. Links to everything are on my website. It's katharineschellman.com. In terms of social media, I'm most often on Instagram, which is Katharine Writes, and that's Katharine with a K.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'm currently, I also have a newsletter, which you can sign up for on my website, which is
good.
at this point the best way to sort of follow along. I tend to pop in and out of social media, especially when I'm drafting. And right now I'm working on book 3 in this series, which is a lot of fun, but tends to keep me off of other parts of the internet while I'm really focusing. So one of the best ways to keep up is to sign up for my newsletter on my website.
I love it. I love it. Everyone should sign up if you haven't already. Katharine, thanks again for stopping by the chat. I appreciate it. The Last Drop of Hemlock is out on June 6th, and it is absolutely magical.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's great talking with you today.
Good talking with you. Hang on for me just a second. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at OutWithDan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.